Ahoy there, fellow travelers. Welcome to E-Travels with E-Trules, a personal and literary podcast of travel adventures and misadventures from around the world. This is Eric Trules, and thanks for listening. Ahoy there, fellow travelers. Thanks for tuning in to this second bonus episode of the podcast since the end of Season 1. Because while the production team and I are busy creating new travelogues for the second season, we definitely want to keep you listening. So today, to satiate your travel podcast appetite, I'm releasing my interview from this past August with Mike Siegel, host of the Travel Tales podcast. Mike is a well-known stand-up comic, both here in LA and around the country. He created the Travel Tales podcast in 2011, which he sees as a lighthearted conversation highlighting the best and worst experiences that travel has to offer. I'm not sure if I qualify for best or worst, but Mike seemed to know me pretty well, as you can hear right off the bat at the top of the interview. But before we go to my guest interview on Mike's show, I want to thank you for listening today to let you know how to catch up with all 20 episodes from Season 1 of this podcast. Please go to the podcast library on my homepage at erictrules.com/podcast, where you can leave your comments at the bottom of each show notes page. There will also be a link to Apple Podcasts and Stitcher for you to subscribe, rate, and review the show, and another link to make a donation if you so choose. All donations, no matter what size, are greatly appreciated, and please know that the podcast could not exist without the support of you loyal listeners. Some of the upcoming sound immersive and musically scored episodes in Season 2 will take us to a cremation ceremony in Bali, Indonesia, where I run into Susan Sarandon and Tim Robbins in a Balinese graveyard. Then we'll go from Hollywood to Deadwood, South Dakota, where I spend a weekend behind bars in Wild Bill Hickok's jail cell. And we'll go to Edinburgh, Scotland, where I twice performed at the Edinburgh Fringe, the largest arts festival in the world, and where I spoke to the ghost of Sir Robert the Bruce. In Season 2, you'll also be hearing many new behind-the-scenes interviews with fellow travelers, artists, and podcasters from around the world, including podcast luminaries like Shannon Moore from Podbean and Kate Erickson from EO Fire, the Entrepreneur on Fire podcast. But now, just a little more background on Mike Siegel before we jump in. When he began appearing on many of his fellow comedians' podcasts around 2010, Mike knew that he wanted to start one of his own. But what would be the theme? What stories did he want to tell? What stories did he want to hear? He realized that he never tired of meeting people from different parts of the world, or of hearing stories from people who had been to places he'd never been. Thus, the birth of the Travel Tales website and podcast, where Mike found a place he could feature not only his own travel writing, but the work of fellow travelers as well. Mike knows that travel can sometimes be intimidating, but with his podcast, he tries to do all he can to convince people to see the world, expand their horizons, and to grow from their experiences. Along with his love of food and drink, Mike is an avid scuba diver, hiker, surfer, skier, and traveler. He loves maps, and he's taken just about every form of transportation known to man, from rickshaws to junk boats, from camel carts to tuk-tuks. He'll try just about anything once, and he suggests that you do the same. In the fall of 2017, Mike went to Greece, Croatia, and perhaps Portugal, and as of this recording, it is unknown whether he's ever coming back. In any case, I want to thank him for his permission to release our interview as a bonus episode on my own show today, and to recommend you check out his Travel Tales podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and online at traveltalespodcast.com. And now, from August 2017, when he was still spotted on the Sunset Strip in Hollywood, take it away, Mike.
Welcome to the Travel Tales Podcast.
The winners are the people with the most stories.
One of the great things about traveling is the people that you meet.
I've slept in bus stations, I've slept on people's floors.
And it's already on fire, and then there's just a gigantic, huge explosion, like out of a Hollywood movie.
It's not right or wrong, it's just different.
We hired like 10 Chinese prostitutes to come be our audience.
We were kidnapped by nuns in Puerto Rico.
Not a good idea to be high when you're packing. You forget a lot of stuff.
I got swine flu.
By the time you've lived through it, it's just a good story.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Travel Tales Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Siegel. Thank you for listening. My guest today is Eric Trules. Before we get to Eric, I want to make a few announcements, starting with the website. That is, of course, traveltalespodcast.com. Go there, check out photos of our guests, see some stories that I've written, some that the guests have written, and also see links to their social media and our social media. And that is, of course, Twitter. You can follow us at Travel Tales Pod on Twitter. Instagram, Travel Tales Podcast on Instagram, and our Facebook page. There's links to that, which is Travel Tales Podcast, and of course, links to Stitcher Radio, where you can subscribe to the show, and iTunes. And if you're on iTunes, I ask all the time, please give us a good rating, because that boosts our presence there and helps more people find the show, and that's a cool thing. If you want to write me, it's traveltalespodcast@gmail.com, traveltalespodcast@gmail.com. Eric Trules is the host and creator of the E-Travels with E-Trules podcast, and he contacted me, and I was glad he did, because I ended up being a guest on his show. I went to meet him at his cool house in Echo Park, which has a killer view, and I'm always a sucker for a killer view. And we went to the studio where he records, Barbershop Studios, and we recorded an episode of his podcast where I was the guest, and then we flipped the table, and he was a guest on my podcast, and that's the interview you're going to hear now. And I like Eric's podcast because in between his interviews, which are kind of like this one, where he goes one-on-one with travelers, his podcast is really a storytelling podcast, and we love a good travel tale here on Travel Tales. And Eric is a performance artist, a longtime performance artist and actor and professor at USC, and he's really a performer. And that's what his show is. If you listen to his podcast, he uses music, he tells a story, he uses sound effects and everything else, and weaves a tale, a travel tale, which is really up our alley here, of course. So find him. You can go to erictrules.com. That's ERICTRULES.com, and then you'll find his podcast and his bio and everything else that he's done. And check out E-Travels with E-Trules. I enjoyed my time meeting Eric, and I hope you will too. Please enjoy my conversation with Eric Trules. Trules. Is Trules short for something? It's got to be, right?
It is. It's one of those stories where
Ellis Island, they shortened it.
You got it. My grandfather came over from someplace near Odessa.
Yep.
It was called Kharkov in the Ukraine. We always called it Russia until Ukraine became its own country. And Meyer, some long name starting with the TRU, was left with 6 letters on the Ellis Island sign-in sheet, and we became Trules.
So you grew up in New York City, a New York City kid.
I was born in Queens Hospital, but then G.I. Joe, my dad, who fought in World War II as an airplane mechanic, and his bride, Roz, had their first son, me, and they moved to the first suburb in America called
Levittown.
One of the few people who can answer that question.
It was funny because I just talked to someone who was reading a book on Robert Moses, who shaped New York City.
Yeah.
And around that time, around the 50s and everything, there was this exodus out of the city, and the suburbs were this new shining place, and they built these giant freeways that were going to lead people out of the city, and they kind of, like a lot of cities around the U.S., they just kind of left the inner city to rot, and all the money left, and a lot of the places in the cities never recovered. But
and they called that place in 1947 with Levittown and Syosset and Westbury, where we moved to. They called that Long Island.
Long Island.
That's right.
That's just like the stereotypical quintessential boomer story. Like your dad came home from the war, they started a family, moved to the suburbs.
That's it. And he took the Long Island Railroad into the city on 40th and Broadway in the garment industry, which fellow Jews called the schmata business, right?
Until now Asia that makes all the clothes.
Well, things have changed.
Yeah.
But I was supposed to become their son, the doctor. And every one of my high school classmates who on my street, we started at the top of the street with Sigmund, Silverman, Fisherman, Trules, Reese, Rubin, and Schwartz.
And then one O'Malley. Somehow.
No, there was no O'Malley. Oh, that's not true. We had a Covington.
Oh.
Warren Covington. He was the band leader for the Joe Franklin show or something like that. And his son, Donnie Covington, was the only wrestler on the street.
So we fast forward. So you're a child of the 50s, you grow up, and then now it's the 60s. Yeah. And things are changing.
Well,
the times you grew your hair out, got crazy. Did you move? Did you stay in the city?
I don't even think you read anything about me. I think you just know the story. That's exactly what happened.
Well, I know you were an actor or a performance artist. Basically.
Now I'm a performance artist, but here's my little brief story of that era. Anyway, the times they were a changing. That's what Bob Dylan said, and that was 62, 3, 4. The girl I had a crush on in high school became sort of a beatnik, and she went into Greenwich Village to see Dylan sing at the Cafe Wah, and her boyfriend became the flute player for the Blues Project on Bleecker Street, and I was left behind. So that when I went to college at the University of Buffalo, and it became 66, 67, and I first tried to expand my mind, which certainly needed expansion. It was so rigid and so set with other people's ideas of becoming a doctor and materialism and having 2 cars and 2.2 kids and
the American dream.
Yeah, following the white picket fence of my parents' imagination. But once the mind was expanded with a little help from my friends.
Friends being LSD, are these the initials of your friends?
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Yeah. I no longer aspired towards any of it. And I dropped calculus twice and physics 3 times. And I said, I don't want to become a doctor. I don't know what I want, but there are sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And although I wasn't very good at the sex for a long time, I did buy the alternative culture that my generation bought into. And we didn't want to conform, and we didn't want to be part of the convention. We wanted to reinvent society and grow our hair long and wear jeans and stop the war and maybe make a positive effect on civil rights. And although there was hypocrisy with our womanizing and things like that, I think we did help stop the war and get Nixon impeached. And that's the generation I'm from. And in my 31-year career as a professor at USC, they allowed me to stand on whatever soapbox I brought or invented with me. And I tried to challenge my students with the most important things that I discovered in my life, which were self-expression and creativity. And that's always what I try to hand my students, the tools and courage to find their own voice and follow their own path, because that's the path I've been on. I've done so many unconventional things, from run for mayor of New York City as a clown against Ed Koch in 1977, finishing 5th out of 4 candidates.
Who did you beat? Oh, no, fifth out of four.
That's right.
Wait a minute.
That's right. Bada boom.
Fifth out of four candidates.
You got it.
So how did you get out of did you get a lottery number on the draft? Did you?
293 out of 365. A lot of my friends left the country. They went to the London School of Economics and moved to Canada. And amazingly, they were forgiven their fleeing the draft. But nobody knew back then. And on my first year upon graduation, on that draft night with the ping pong balls, I stood in front of the TV and somewhere between trembling and sweating, I saw my ping pong ball come up 293, which allowed me not to flee the country, not to get a draft deferment by going to any kind of school or teaching elementary school somewhere. But I got in my car, a 1964 Pontiac Tempest.
Sweet ride.
It was
Gas was what, 10 cents a gallon maybe?
31 cents in 1970. And that car's name was Wolfie, named after Steppenwolf from the Herman Hesse novel. And I drove up and down the country like it was one big map for 6 months, from New York down to the Florida Keys, up through Tallahassee and Muhammad Ali's home in Louisville and Bob Dylan's home in Hibbing, Minnesota. And I stopped in every place I ever heard of and many places I never heard of. And I ended up in Chicago looking up this high school crush, second time she's on my conversation. And she was then married to an Amish conscientious objector, which kept him out of the war. But she lived in Old Town Chicago, which you probably know from your time.
I'll be there in August 13th through 15th at Zany's Comedy Club on Wells Street.
And on Wells Street, I think the address was 1760 or something like that, there was the theater company in residence from Columbia College, Chicago. And I climbed the steps into this big open room where they were rehearsing Naked Lunch by William Burroughs.
Oh, boy.
I had long hippie hair, and they had a character named Abby Hoffman, based on the 68 convention Yippie. And as soon as they saw me, they said, "Are you an actor?" I said,
well, you are now.
That's right. You want to play Abby Hoffman in Naked Lunch by William Burroughs? And I said, give me a day. And I didn't take the job, but right in the lobby was an audition sign for a modern dancer. This company had just lost its one and only male dancer. And I was this volcano waiting to explode and very physical and athletic. And I became a modern dancer for the next 7 years, from 1970 to 77 in Chicago, Illinois.
Wow.
It changed
that must
my
have
life.
Been something. The old Mary Daly days.
Dick Daly.
Dick Daly.
Yeah.
So where were you living in Chicago? And was that first trip in the Pontiac where it started the travel bug?
I'd say, yeah. I think I took a little conventional ski trip to Innsbruck, Austria when I was in college, but that was part of the convention bubble and the little package deal. But that first trip right after college was my taking the road less traveled, which ended up in Chicago. And I ended up living 100% on the near north side, a little west of the lake. I lived on Halstead and Diversey.
Okay. I used to live around Belmont and Racine.
Our dance company called Mo Ming was at Belmont and Sheffield, right near the Quiet Night. The Quiet Night.
Quiet Night. A lot of people played at the Quiet Night.
Yeah.
Famous place. Yeah. So Chicago, 7 years. When did you start getting really around the world? When did that happen? Like overseas? Were you a backpacker? Were you that guy? Like
I was not a hippie or a backpacker. I was an artist and a believer in the alternative culture and the power and transcendence of art. So even in Chicago, I'll bet you heard of the Kingston Mines Theater.
Sure, it's still there.
I think it's still there, yeah.
Blues Club.
So I was in this dance company and sort of a man about town just for being in the alternative dance culture. And the Ridiculous Theater Company, which did these gay drag shows, came to Chicago, and they cast me in a show called The Whores of Babylon, where I played Samson to 3 Delilahs, 2 in drag. And it was a great late-night sensation at midnight all summer long. And then that company and that show went to Paris. So I went in the summer, I think, of 72. And it was my first experience of traveling with my work. And that's the best way to travel. It's one of the best ways to travel. What's wonderful about it is that you've been recognized often or invited to do your work. You're given a hotel. They want to hear your story. They treat you well with respect. I premiered my documentary feature film about my relationship with my criminal uncle. This was an autobiographical feature-length film called The Poet and the Con. I premiered that in Switzerland in 1998. I went twice to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival as a solo performer in 1988, where my show was nominated for Best Show of the Fringe, and I went again in 1995. So I've been traveling quite a bit under the privilege of bringing my work around the world. I had a couple of Fulbright grants, which allowed me to teach in Malaysia, in Romania, on the island of Borneo with these kids coming from the little village kampongs.
What were you teaching them?
Solo performance, how to tell their own stories.
But isn't storytelling, it's in every single culture, right? And it's one of the oldest forms of performance. Maybe the oldest, probably.
You will not get an argument from me on that. But listen to this, Mike. Those stories are about the magical crocodiles and the talking monkeys on the island of Borneo and Mount Kinabalu. They're traditional tales. And what Asian culture, particularly in the last many millennium when the culture has turned primarily Muslim, is very much not about personal storytelling. In fact, the whole culture is not about person. It's about conformity to the religion, to the community, to the family. And so when I would ask these students to raise their hand or have an idea or be themselves, this was really foreign. And I found myself being really American, representing my country just the way the Fulbright grant was paying me to do in teaching these people, my colleagues, the kids, the culture, about the power of personal voice and storytelling and being oneself. And it was confronting and confusing to this culture that was so foreign to it.
Well, were the local leaders or religious leaders or anything to think of you as a threat? I mean, if you were going to, put new ideas in their heads, a lot of times they don't want that.
They very well might have, Mike. And I was a stranger in a strange land. When I came to the island of Borneo in East Malaysia in January of 2002, just a few months after 9/11, they had images on their screensavers next to me. My colleagues had images of Osama bin Laden as the most powerful man in the world, the most respected and famous man in the world, because he had stood up to the most powerful country, Goliath America, and he was their hero, David. And that was shocking to me, but I realized that I was no longer the center of the world, and I had to try to understand where other people come from. So that was difficult for me, even though I'm not a patriot. I'm more an expatriate by personality and nature. But to see bin Laden's image, and I was teaching at two Islamic universities, one in Borneo, and then I came back to the capital for another 4 months in Kuala Lumpur, particularly in the outback in the island of Borneo. It was very far from anything that I knew in America. And I had to be really open-minded and a little bullheaded at the same time to believe that what I had to offer was of value to these people. And I'm still in touch with many of those students, so I believe it was.
How long were you there?
I was in Malaysia for 4 months on the island of Borneo and the northeast coast in a city called Kota Kinabalu, where I tell some travel tales.
Yes,
on this.
I heard your story about the bucket brigade. And
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was what the British did on the island of Borneo with their steam engine and their railroad, which, of course, when I went on it, broke down, and we had to pour steam into the engine from these blue plastic buckets. But one of the great things about traveling and not working too hard as a Fulbright scholar is that I got to stay in the long houses of indigenous people. I got to see turtles give birth and lay their eggs on turtle islands. I got to see orangutans rehabilitated in animal rehabilitation centers, and it was brilliant and all on my country's dime of renting me a car and paying me to pass along what I genuinely thought were American ideas.
So in terms of Asia, I know your wife is
Indonesian.
Is this where you met her?
I met her on a solo trip. I went with my friend, who I call El Mario, a Latino dude from Los Angeles who's traveled a lot. And we went to Bangkok in 2000. His goal was to end up in Cambodia at the temples at Angkor Wat that were tough to get to in 2000. We took some dangerous transportation there with the Khmer Rouge still shooting at each other in Cambodia.
In 2011, I just flew in.
I'll
It was
bet
easy.
you did. I'll bet there were.
Siem Reap.
You could see that was starting to happen, but it wasn't available when we arrived. So we separated ways after Angkor Wat, and I went all throughout Southeast Asia for about 2 months by myself. And my goal was to finally end on the magical island of Bali, where I was going to avoid the tourist capital called Kuta Beach.
Yeah, that's a bad one.
So
Just drunken Australian kids.
Surfing.
Yeah.
So I took literally a taxi from the airport to the cultural capital in the center of the island called Ubud. But on the way back, I had to fly out the next morning. So I stayed in Kuta Beach in a hotel, and in front of an ATM bank, turning around asking for directions, I asked the first two people for directions, and one of them turned out to be my future wife.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
Wow. How was she adjusted to America? And what was, because I've friends who's married or met women overseas, especially from Asia. It's not easy for them to get a visa, right? To come over, or
depends when they tried. I don't think it's ever easy, but she came, we met in 2000. I worked for about 6 months to get her a visa, and she arrived on August 3rd, 2001, about a month before 9/11 from Indonesia.
Good timing.
The most populous Muslim country in the world. So she probably would not have received a visa after 9/11, but she received a 5-year multi-entry visa because I wrote the consul general in Indonesia, and I said, listen, man, I'm 54, and I know I'm supposed to apply for a fiancé visa saying that I will marry this girl within 6 months, but the visa will only be good for 6 months. But come on, I know you're an adult of my years. How about not putting the pressure on me and just, I don't know if I want to marry her after 6 months, just let her come, give me a break. And he did. And he gave her a 5-year, multi-year visa entry. And this has been probably the longest, most incredible journey of my life, watching my wife come from not speaking English, from a third world, pretty primitive family and culture in Sumatra, to take ESL classes in Los Angeles, meet all her fellow immigrants, stand on immigration lines in front of 300 Spring Street downtown, and do all the legal work. I did all the application work to get her the sequence of I-94s and green card, and 2 years waiting to finally become a citizen 7 years later. But that was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's great.
A beautiful thing.
That's great. Did you know her language when you were there?
No, very little.
So how did you communicate at all if she didn't know English and you didn't know her language?
Well, Mike, the
universal language of love, of course, I think.
Yes, but the universal language of the need to communicate.
Yeah.
Plus, I used to be a clown and never spoke. So I am able to communicate well. And she was patient enough and curious and hungry enough to learn English that she would spend days and who knows weeks and just writing a simple email at first before I went back to Bali and met her for a second time. But these two people met at a very synchronistic time in their lives on the planet by accident. And 17 years later, we're still together.
That's great.
But to watch her transformation from what I said, non-English speaking, 31 years my junior, not knowing who Bob Dylan or Richard Nixon were, this was a challenge. But for her, it was a transformation. And she's still under 40, but she's coming into her stride. As I retire, she's working hard. She's reading books on economics now that she didn't understand the English before, and I never understood the economics. But she's really taking over the driving wheel for me as I age and she ages. I'm on the way out, and she's still on the way up.
Well, you're giving me hope here.
Yeah,
because I haven't settled down yet, and it's like any age it could happen. Any age and in any place, apparently. And it
sounds like you're ready after being that artistic, irreverent guy and having too many relationships. I found after enough travel, particularly travel, that I had no one to share my travel stories with. I'd just been to all these places that I could remember.
Well, let's go back to that. I mean, what are some of you've been to so many places, a few that stand out in your mind. Have you ever had any real, scary incidents? You ever get thrown in jail? Any come across tough cops? Any bribes thrown around?
Bribes are common in Southeast Asia, so I've had my share. But here's a good tuk-tuk story, since you've mentioned tuk-tuks, and that's usually a pedaled little rickshaw. The rickshaws used to be pulled by Asians, not only Chinese, but all over Asia and Southeast Asia. Well, tuk-tuks now are either motorized or pedaled. I had just arrived in Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be called Saigon,
sure.
Right? And it was probably my first night, and I wanted to go out and see the city. So I came out in front of the little hotel where me and El Mario was staying, and I took the first tuk-tuk, and he took me out from the center of the city. And I said, don't we have to go that way? And he was pedaling, not speaking too much. Yeah, I got is what you could imagine. Mm-hmm. The next thing that happened is that he was trying to buy me a girl. They were all over this part of town where he took me. I was not looking for a woman at that time. So I said, drive on. And the next thing I knew, a policeman that seemed to be his best friend stopped me and miraculously found a roach in the tuk-tuk that I had nothing to do with. And they wanted to bring me to the police station. And I started screaming, instinctively and stupidly. I said, you're not taking me to any fucking police station. I was really rude and loud and probably risked my life. I scared them with my volume. But they were insisting upon taking me to the police station and that I had put that drug there. And we know the drug stories. And for my generation was Midnight Express.
Oh, yeah, the Turkish prison.
And I didn't.
You only need to see that movie once.
I didn't
to
see
scare you straight.
I didn't see the Turkish prison as being much different than the Vietnamese prison. So I was just about on my way there, and I was a little prepared for this. I reached into my underwear and took out $100 United States dollar bill, and I gave it to the policeman, and I was driven back into town. So my answer fit right up your alley, but such is the way of the world, and it's a good idea to ride around with a $100 bill in your underwear when you travel, because one never knows, do one.
Have you done much of Africa?
I have not. I've only done the peripheries. Been to Cairo, I've been to Alexandria because my favorite books are called The Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell, best friend of Henry Miller, also one of my favorite authors. So I went to Cairo and Alexandria when the borders of Israel were still flexible, 1999. And I've been to Morocco. I crossed the border when I did an educational conference in Andalusia, southern Spain.
That's on my list too, Morocco.
Oh, it's cool. And you have to go to this place called Chefchaouen.
Chefchaouen.
Yeah, it's the cannabis capital of Morocco. The plants are taller than you are.
I just had guests on my show on the Travel Tales that they talked about that place.
Chefchaouen.
Yes, Chefchaouen.
It's
such a
no
unique name. I
coincidence.
remember it just now. And they told me that Marrakesh was overrated.
Well,
They're just trying to hustle you.
people
basically.
have been there. It's like Kuta
Yeah.
Beach in Bali or Telegraph Avenue in San Francisco and Berkeley. You know, some places used to be and now are just overdeveloped. But Chefchaouen, you arrive on a bus and you are in the middle of the old Medina in Arabic Morocco. And, it's beautiful. All that Moorish architecture from the Muslims coming across North Africa in the 7th and 8th century and ending up in southern Spain.
Have you ever had any issues being Jewish overseas, that especially in Muslim countries? Do you worry? Or have you ever been worried?
I have been worried. When I got this Fulbright grant to go to East Malaysia, Islamic University, my American friend said, "You crazy man, what's a Jew boy from New York going to do in Islamic Malaysia shortly after 9/11?" I just didn't want to pass up the opportunity, and I was invited by a university. I thought I'd be a little insulated, and it turned out two things. A, these people really didn't know what a Jew was. B, they identified and aligned themselves with their Arabic Muslim brothers. So they hated Jews by osmosis, even though they didn't really know what one was. So I don't think they recognized me as being Jewish. They did recognize me as a non-Muslim who had brought my fiancée, my fingers are putting these air quotes on it, because I was told not to bring an unmarried woman with me to Islamic Malaysia, but I did, but I called her my fiancée. But I think they intercepted some of my email to my Fulbright coordinator, and they realized that my fiancée was not only unmarried, but just my girlfriend. And they would sarcastically constantly ask, "How's your fiancé, Professor Trules?" Condemning me, while at the same time they were allowed to have 4 wives each, and actually was only living with the last one, and any of their previous children were lucky to have any child support.
Yeah.
So it's another, I'm not one for conventional religion. There's just too much hypocrisy there. And sure, I identify myself as a Jew, but more as culture, not as a religious practitioner. But sometimes even being American is a liability.
Yeah, absolutely.
And depending where you are, it's easier to say you're Canadian.
Yes. Especially now. Now I was saying the cruise ships, that's a joke I had because we always have so many Canadians. It's, now I don't even waste any time. I just come off the plane wearing a hockey helmet. Just that's it. I'm with them. The ones with the skates.
Being an ugly American has always been a challenge in the modern world. But
Yeah,
now,
I mean, there's a 50-50 shot they'll hate you wherever you go.
But now with our president, I think it's
gotten worse now.
Much worse, you know?
And I don't want to talk about it when I go. I was just in Australia and for 3 days, and if one more person asked me about Trump, I was going to go crazy. It's like I don't want to just say I'm sorry and let's move on, because I don't want to talk, because they're fascinated. They can't believe it. So. Well,
it's true. It's a giant punch in the eye of the whole world. But what I like about travel, since we're on the Travel Tales podcast, is it's the only time that I stop looking at the news. I'm completely disconnected. It could be for a week or 2 months. I literally have not gone out of my way to see one iota of news.
No, it's great.
Nor have I missed it.
No, not at all.
It's
You tune out,
amazing.
it's awesome. And I always say this about traveling, and I'm never more present than when I'm traveling. Where every day I'm noticing everything around me, and every self-help class here says the same thing. You have to live in the moment and be present, and
Travel
and
makes
it's so
you
easy.
do it.
Yeah, travel forces that hand. And here I'm always thinking about something else, and we look past what's in front of us all the time. And in travel, it's all there, and you're noticing everything. And I'm never more present than when I am traveling.
That's one of the only times you'll get an amen from me.
So, in terms of, you gave me a quiz on yours, so let's give you a little quiz. Name a country that you always talk up and tell people to go to that's maybe off the beaten track.
I'd say first off, well, a lot, but first off, I was going to say Southeast Asia, but that would not be Thailand or Bali. That would be Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. These are friendly people. Wherever you go, no matter how far off the beaten track, people in the tourist business speak English. So you'll always find you're lucky to be born at this time in the world history where English is the predominant language.
Absolutely.
So it's easy to travel and cheap in Southeast Asia. So I would highly recommend it. It's not dangerous. It's different than traveling in the Middle East. I loved southern Ecuador, where we went to this. I just took the local indigenous buses through the Andes with the women in bowler hats and serapes. Now, my wife did not like that so much because she's from those indigenous lands in Indonesia. But
I came to America to get away from that.
this is a challenge for us to travel together. But I love staying in the longhouses and seeing how the oldest and most natural way of living in those lands, to learn its history and to see these indigenous tribes. And even though sometimes those people are dressing up for the tourist industry, you can still learn a lot and see how people used to live communally together. Many families in one long house, how they were dependent on the sun and the moon and the sky and the crops they grew. And there were no iPhones and emails. And
I still haven't done Ecuador. I still haven't done it. Did you go to Galapagos when you were there?
I went to the poor man's Galapagos off Pisco. Pisco is a coastal town where you would take a ferry to the Galapagos, but that's for tourists. That's expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive.
It's magnificent, but those sea lions were also off on the Pisco coast, and you get to have the Pisco sour.
I'm sure.
Yes, that's right.
Sure.
That's a famous alcoholic drink.
Give me a country that you'd be okay if you never went back to.
Cuba.
Really?
It's the only one. But now I think Cuba will be changing. But I went in 2009. I wanted to see it before Fidel was gone.
Yeah, I went in 2011.
I went from Jamaica because
I went from Cancun.
Oh, there you go. Those are the two ways to conveniently go then. But I went as a solo traveler with my wife. I mean, the two of us went. No tour groups. So all we experienced was seeing ourselves as dollar bills. The country was so poor and desperate and angry and displaced. The doctors were driving cabs to try to make a living, and all those cool fit cars from the 50s, their emission systems were completely busted, and those were not cool cars. They just didn't allow Cubans to buy anything modern. And I found it a very depressing country where I was just seen as a way to monetize. Now, when you travel, you're paying for hotels, you're paying for food. You are a traveler, tourist, whatever you can manage. But in Jamaica, right across the water where I went to, those people were equally poor, but they were joyous. And so I left Cuba to go back to Jamaica to travel around the island with 3 teenagers. And we had a wonderful time and shared food. And here in Cuba, it's the only country I could think of that I might say something like that about.
Right. Jamaica can be dangerous, though. Jamaica's rough.
Kingston is rough.
Yeah.
Kingston is the capital. They don't recommend or allow you to walk around by yourself. But get out on the countryside where
It's gorgeous.
with the Rastamen and the people who believe in reggae. They grow their own crops and vegetables. They share it. They're
They
beautiful.
smoke it.
They smoke it all the time. They share the smoke, and it's not unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
It's just sort of beautiful.
Give me one in terms of, we'll go to food now, your favorite country food-wise.
I'm not a foodie.
Okay.
I like to eat. I like delicious food. And I think most places you can find delicious food. I'll go with you. Italy has great food.
Yes.
France has great food. I like Chinese food better than I like. My wife eats hot, spicy food.
Yeah.
I can't handle it.
Oh, really? I love it.
So I can't go to a lot of good restaurants in
right.
Southeast Asia.
Ooh, that's tough.
I have to say, hold the spice. And they go, okay, pal.
Okay, let's say your favorite deli in New York. Give us one recommendation.
Used to be the Carnegie Deli, but now
closed it, right?
they sold out. They should have closed that place. It used to be the biggest packed corned beef sandwiches.
It was too much. Come
it
on.
Was.
It was
I used to get
ridiculous.
multiple rye bread slices and
Sure.
make several sandwiches. But now it used to be I like the Second Avenue Deli. I guess I'd have to go with the Second Avenue Deli, but I did really like the Carnegie before it became too gentrified and
You got an LA deli?
expensive. I guess I like the pastrami at
Langers.
At Langers, yeah.
Best pastrami.
And the corned beef is great too.
Yeah.
Now they've done the same thing at the Grand Street Market, but it's overpriced and
Sure.
it's just a tourist trap, So I'll stick with the Langers on Alvarado and 6th, I think.
Yeah, right by MacArthur Park.
Yes.
What was the craziest thing you ate overseas that you couldn't believe you ate? Any insects in Asia or any of
Oh,
those?
sure.
Yeah.
I ate grasshoppers in Oaxaca in Mexico. So whatever they have, I will try without the hot sauce.
Sure.
I think we ate things like frogs and scorpions and you name it, anything on legs and with wings.
Country you haven't been to yet, but always wanted to go.
Well, I would say Russia, but if it works out, fingers crossed, I have a booking to teach in Moscow in November. So
Wow.
I'm looking forward to that. And because my family's from there, I guess I want to see it. Moscow's a world capital. I know I'll be treated well because
course.
they're
Well, there's-
hiring me.
Yeah, they
so-
say there's Moscow and St. Petersburg, and then
Yes.
the rest of, because those are the two most diverse, if there's any diversity,
Civilized.
which is not much, but it's the most international and cultural
Yes.
diverse parts. And then there's the rest of Russia.
Yeah, but
It's
yes.
like
but-
there's New York and LA, and then everybody else, So Russia and anywhere else that you've been dying to go to and never made it?
you must know, and every traveler knows, there is no way to see every place and everything
No.
in the world because it's just impossible. You could go finer and finer and more micro and more micro. And I haven't even been to Australia or New Zealand
You're kidding.
because it was English speaking. And
Yeah.
I'm a little more exotic and want to find
I
more
get
things.
that.
But I do want to go there.
New Zealand is gorgeous. New Zealand
I'm
is very,
sure.
very pretty.
I'm sure. I haven't been to Prague. I want to go to Prague.
Poland too. I like Krakow a lot.
I heard it's wonderful and they have great theater there. I'm a theater practitioner.
Right.
So I'd like to see some of the companies there. And I've been to some East European. I did another Fulbright in Bucharest, Romania for a while. So I saw all these old Eastern Onion dome churches.
Yeah.
And I
I've
find
never been to Bucharest.
Oh, it's
I love Budapest. Budapest is fantastic.
that's even more Western
Yeah.
than Bucharest.
Yeah.
Bucharest more
It was closed
undulating.
for so long. you
Yes,
know.
yes. But that's what was particularly wonderful about teaching Romanian students. In 2010, when I went, it was more like 1965 in America. It was the sex, drugs, rock and roll, open mind, curiosity, hunger for what America represented back then. And these students were creative and wonderful.
What I do find in Eastern Europe, much more so than Western Europe, where they call Western Europe now old Europe, and in the former Soviet bloc countries, what I find, at least my personal opinion, amongst the young people, that they're much more positive and much more excited about the future. They're just looking ahead. They're brushing off the past, and they're just excited about what's to come. Whereas the people in Spain and Italy and France, the young people are just angry. They're over it. They're just resigned to the fact that their economy stinks, and we're going to have it worse than our parents. And whereas in Eastern Europe, we're going to have it better than our parents. We're going to travel more. They're so excited. Whereas
I'm afraid that's quite true.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like what you said about the immigrants. A new family, a new person with a family coming here to America works the hardest and is upwardly mobile and sends money back to their country. Well, these people coming out from under the thumb of communism, which turned out to be a lot more true than I ever expected to discover from all those stereotypes we were taught back in the 50s and 60s. But that was a repressive society. So now self-expression and creativity, the very things that I cherish and teach, are really absorbed and consumed there with such passion. The young people are alive and passionate and will have better lives than their parents.
Well, you've seen, and we both have seen, so much technology change our way of life, and especially with travel. What's your favorite piece of technology that's helped travel the most for you? And what's a piece of technology you wish never existed?
Yeah. I like to have an internet connection when I travel, because I started my e-travels with e-Trules were literally emails from little internet shops in sometimes very slow connected places back to my friends. So
the phone is an amazing thing that you can have it anywhere.
I didn't have a smartphone back in 2000.
Oh, me neither.
I went to these internet shops with
cafes.
desktops.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But it was a way to connect and share your journey with somebody, particularly if you were traveling by yourself. It was a fun, communicative, artistic thing to do. And then as the technology developed and you could add pictures and have a blog and a podcast, wow, I enjoy it. I think it's a new development of our time in history of civilization that you can connect to so many places all over the planet, and you have access to the entire history of mankind on a little device.
What do you think the downside of all of it is? We've become less human in a way?
Yeah, 100% true. Overconnected. You used to write a letter. It took 2 weeks to get there. You waited 3 weeks or a month or a while to get it back. And that was frustrating, but normal. Now you get 50 or how many emails in your box, and you can barely keep up with them. And that's supposed to be a convenience, which it is, but it's an overburden, and too much time on Facebook and social media. It's a dehumanizing component of the technology. It's not a great asset.
In traveling over the last 50 years, I guess, have you noticed a difference in, I guess, Americans from that first car ride you took across country? I mean, it couldn't have been easy I know we all watched Easy Rider, being a long hair, going to some of these parts of the country. Did you get any harassment or anything like that back then?
Well, you asked another good question. I never told that story. I will, but the country has changed. I think we talked about this on my show. I could drive across country. I went up and down America to all those cities from New York.
Hitchhike? You could pick
no,
up
I was
hitchhikers?
driving.
But you picked up hitchhikers.
Yes, I did. But I drove the Tempest, and I went to Charleston, South Carolina, Tallahassee, Florida, Charlotte, North Carolina. I just went into any town I ever heard of. I didn't know anybody. And I'd get there at dusk after day driving. I'd roll down the window to the first person I saw, a little like asking my wife, a woman for directions, turned out to be my wife. Well, I didn't marry any of these other people, but I would say, where's the long hair part of town? And I had long Jufro locks.
Right.
And they would send me to the coffee shop in the Greenwich Village of the town.
Right.
And I would
Hopefully
walk
there's a
into-
university somewhere nearby.
Sometimes it was
Yeah.
sometimes it was the university, and I'd walk into the shop and I'd say, "Hi, my name is Trules. I have no place to stay tonight. You see my hair? You know, I'm one of you. It's the time. It's 1970."
Sure.
And they all brought me home with free places to stay. And after a while, too much weed, because I didn't want it after a while. It just made everything the same. So, but there was a counterculture then. And now there's a culture of interconnected technology entrepreneurs, you know, so it's a different time.
You'd
and
have it all
culture.
set up. You'd have before you even rolled into town nowadays.
Yes,
It's like,
yes.
yeah, we talked online for months. Hey, it's good to see you finally in person.
This is a really significantly different time, and that's only 50 years ago. So, you know, the timeline and crunch of human evolution just gets on a shorter and shorter leash.
What about the environment in terms of what you've seen change? Around the world, it's tough. I see it mostly in plastic everywhere, and like in beaches. The beaches in Bali, it's sad. You know, when you see the amount of garbage that's there. I mean, I'm wondering the effect of what was it like going in 1970, going across country. I mean, this is pre-catalytic converter. We know that much.
Yes,
But,
that's true. The country, either I was an unwashed countercultural guy. There wasn't a lot of garbage or dirt in America in 1970, but I promise, in Indonesia in 1970 and in 2017, there's a lot of garbage because of the education and the culture. They are in turn trained to recycle. They are in turn trained not to throw their newspapers and plastic and food anywhere in the sea, on the streets. There are chickens and wild dogs walking around in the third world, and it will take a long time, or it will never happen, that the consciousness is raised to what we call a first world level, where we think that recycling and keeping a clean environment is valuable. This does not happen in many places in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Not then and not now.
If you could wave your magic wand, we'll wrap this up in a minute here, but if you could wave a magic wand, say you're king of the world, you're God now, what would be the first thing you changed? What do you think the number one pressing issue is?
Oh, I'd be sillily optimistic and think I was John Lennon, try to carry out John Lennon's "Give Peace a Chance" and end wars, and people stop fearing their neighbors, because actually the Arabs and the Jews have the same noses and lived in the same cities, you know. So stop fearing the other and know that you can stay in the spare bedroom or on the floor of your neighbor, and your neighbor is not your enemy. And we could trust and not think that money and success I would go back to my hippie values. Even though I wasn't a hippie, I believed in the values of those times before blue jeans were commercialized into whatever brands they were, and when long hair was grown as a statement of rebellion and freedom. Because those are two things I bought into and I still believe in. And if I could pass them on with my magic wand, I think we'd all live in a healthier, more friendly, peaceful world.
What do you think all this travel has taught you about yourself and about people in general and America?
Those are probably three different questions,
Yeah.
but I'll try. I think it's taught me that people have a lot more in common with each other than differences, that we're fear and hate the other because they wear a different dress or have a different skin color. But like I said, all humans care about their offspring and progeny and raising children and giving them a future, a better future than they have, and putting food on their table and in their mouths and getting a good night's sleep and feeling safe and in transcendence, whether that means believing in God or believing, being connected to the land and animist, totem gods, that we have a lot more in common with each other as humans than the media and our fears put in our mind. What I've learned about myself, I can't, that I'm an American who's not very proud of my government and my country, particularly growing up in the 60s, but I have a lot to be grateful for. I have a lot of freedom. I can bring my new friend Mike Siegel over to a studio in Echo Park in the middle of the day. I have enough money to live on. I am a member of a very small percentage of privileged people who have good health and enough to live on, particularly when you travel the world and see so many other people not in that position. So it's made me grateful, and that's a good thing. You asked me one more thing. America. It's made me see my country both as a meddler and materialist and interferer in the politics and lives of so many other humans on the planet. But it's also seen me, allowed me to see my country as the land of opportunity that my wife and her immigrant friends still come to, and where she can still change her life experience and send money back to her family. So life is complicated and contradictory. And that's one of the things that an artist and hopefully a podcaster can bring to the table. Things are not one-dimensional, all black or white. It's the interesting shades of gray and the contradictions that make life interesting.
Well, speaking of the podcast, this is the point now where you can plug the podcast, give the people your handles, your addresses, and where they can find you.
Well, I hope you throw this into the top of the show with your introduction because we haven't mentioned it till now. But I'm Eric Trules, and I'm a host and chief storyteller of the E-Travels with E. Trules podcast. You can find it on my homepage, erictrules.com.
Trules.
That's ERICTRULES.com/podcast. And you can get to all those episodes in the library because hopefully if you hear this interview on Mike's show, you'll try to listen to some of my travel stories, which I think are unique. And we haven't talked much about it, but I think they're unique because they are immersive. I work with an original music composer and a sound designer, and you actually are taken to the chicken squawks and gunshots and train travels and airplanes and airport sounds right in the episode. And I don't give any shout outs to discount travel or hotels or ways to travel. I tell my own travel stories, and I hope by being honest and true and hopefully a little insightful and funny that other people can relate to these stories and realize some of the things I've been talking about, that we have a lot of things in common, and that travel can be full of adventure and misadventure, and it's expansive and fun.
I was impressed by it. It was it's storytelling. I mean, you're a storyteller. So, folks, if you want to hear good stories from a good storyteller, tune into Eric's podcast. And thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on your show.
It was a good match. I'm glad you came. And shout out to Scott Barber at the Barbershop Studio.
Scott, way to go.
Thank you, Mike.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Eric.
Music supervised by Amanda Yamate. Sound designed by Alicia Bermudez. Recorded by Scott Barber at the Barbershop Recording Studio in Echo Park, Los Angeles, California. Produced by Harry Duran at Fullcast. This podcast has been partially supported with a USC Capstone Grant. Thanks to USC and the entire production team for their support. Please contact me at erictrules.com to let me know what you think, how I'm doing, and anything else you'd like to hear, learn, or receive by listening to the podcast. Until next time, happy trails.